Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the orientation session for the CRC. And thank you very much for taking your time, despite the difficult situation and your busy schedule. So this is a true commitment. Thank you very much. Today is the second CRC orientation session, webinar session. The first one we organized a few weeks ago. In the first webinar, we introduced the mandate of the CRC and also the process for listing of chemicals in Annex 3. So today, we are delighted to have two CRC members to present two topics. So we have two topics for today. One is on the application of criteria of Annex 2 to the Rotterdam Convention. And the second topic is on the process for intersessional task group. Both topics are really very relevant to the intersessional work of the CRC, which will start soon. So I'm very delighted to have Ms. Jürgen Helbig from the European Commission to deliver the first presentation. Jürgen was a CRC member over many years, and after a short break, now he joined the committee again since 1st May of this year. Jürgen was also for many years the chair of the CRC and has led in many times also the intersessional work and contact and drafting work. So we would like to invite Jürgen to deliver the first presentation on the criteria of application of criteria of Annex 2. Before that, I would also like to mention that we will also leave time for discussions. So if you have questions, please don't be shy. So after each presentation, we will give you the opportunity to ask questions. So the floor is over to you, Jürgen.
Thanks a lot, Yun, and hello, dear colleagues. Welcome to those who are new on the Chemical Review Committee. Welcome to this committee and to the work of the committee. I will now give a brief presentation on the criteria for listing banned or severely restricted chemicals in Annex 3 to the Convention, and those criteria are laid down in Annex 2 to the Convention. The next slide, please. So the next slide gives us already quite some information. It refers to notifications forwarded, and it refers to the criteria laid down in Annex 2. And before diving into the details of those criteria, I would like to highlight a few issues as introductory remarks. I think they are very important for our work, and therefore I would like to mention them already at the beginning. So the first thing, which is quite important from my perspective, is that we review notifications of final regulatory action submitted by parties. And what are those notifications? You already followed some training, so you are more or less familiar with the content of the notification, but I would like to repeat it anyway. A notification of final regulatory action is, at least in my view, and to put it in simple words, it's a description of a process undertaken by a party to review a chemical, and this description goes into the details of what kind of review has been undertaken, but it also explains then how this review was used in order to come to a regulatory decision. So the notification describes the process of the review, but it also describes then how the result of the review has been used in order to come to a regulatory decision, and it describes also the regulatory decision. So this is, in a few words, a notification. And we are requested to review such a notification against the criteria laid down in Annex 2. Those criteria, and this is again quite important from my perspective, those criteria are quite unique, and you should really read them very carefully and consider them because quite often they are confused with other procedures, with other processes, in particular when listening to arguments put forward by parties, sometimes when we discuss the listings recommended by the CRC at the conference of the parties. So therefore, please bear in mind that that what we are doing here when reviewing the notification is not a risk or hazard assessment of the chemical. So the CRC is not requested to conclude whether a chemical is a hazardous chemical or whether the use of a chemical represents a high risk either to human health or to environment. This is not the job of the CRC. So we are not doing a hazard or risk assessment of a chemical. In addition, we are not judging whether the decision taken by a party is correct or not correct. And in particular, we are not judging or whether we would take the same decision if we would be in the position to take a regulatory decisions. So it's not in order to judge on the decision taken by a party, because this is also sometimes put forward as argument by saying, well, considering, for example, the risks that are posed by this chemical, we would not have banned this chemical, as an example. So again, we are not requested to do this work. We are requested to stick to the criteria laid down in Annex 2 and to do the review of the notification against those criteria. And I will now go into the details of the criteria and explain how we applied them in the past. And you can certainly, and you should, also consult the handbook, because the handbook provides a lot of more details, a lot of examples that give more information and explain better than I can do it now in this brief presentation how the criteria are applied. The next slide, please. So the first criterion that we have to review is criterion A, which reads to confirm that the final regulatory action has been taken in order to protect human health or the environment. And this information is contained in the notification of final regulatory action, where the party submitting the notification is requested to inform on whether the regulatory action has been taken to protect either human health or the environment or both. So you can consult the notification and you find the information given by the notifying party. The next slide, please. Then we continue with criterion B, and criterion B is quite complex. It's already quite long text. The CRC is requested to establish that the final regulatory action has been taken as a consequence of risk evaluation. Please note that the term risk evaluation is used here and not risk assessment, and that this evaluation shall be based on a review of scientific data in the context of the conditions prevailing in the party in question. So it's a quite complex exercise. We have to check whether a risk evaluation was done and whether this risk evaluation took into account the prevailing conditions in the party that provided the notification. And for this purpose, and now we come to some sub criteria which facilitate, in fact, then a conclusion on criterion B. And the first sub-criterion is that data have been generated according to scientifically recognized methods. Then the second, and we will go into more details later in this presentation, The second is that the data reviews have been performed and documented according to generally recognized scientific principles and procedures. And the third is that the final regulation was taken on the based on a risk evaluation involving the prevailing conditions within the party. So it's mainly two elements: is that we should check whether scientifically recognized methods have been used, that the documentation has been done properly, and then that the prevailing conditions in the party have been considered. When we conclude on whether the criterion is met or not, we conclude on the criterion as a whole. This conclusion as a whole is only possible if all the three sub-criteria are met. Otherwise, the conclusion would be that criterion B is not met. And we will now go into the sub-criteria in more detail. The next slide, please. For I already mentioned the handbook. So for this process of reviewing, we have some guidance in the handbook, this guidance includes practical examples that the committee has already been confronted with, and where it has determined that the criteria are met. And in addition, you should note that guidance is also linked to guidance given by the Conference of the Parties on risk evaluation, for example, on risk evaluation done under other multilateral environmental agreements. And this helps to ensure a consistent approach to the application of these criteria. So this is a little bit of background information, and we continue with the next slide, please. Again, a reminder, a risk evaluation considers hazard information, so describing the toxicological properties of a chemical, but it also considers exposure. Exposure being some assessment of whether an organism, either humans or the environment, come into contact with a chemical, and to which extent this can then lead to adverse effects. The next slide, please. So we consider hazard information and exposure information and look at them first separately, and then we put the picture then together. So the hazard information, normally it's not generated by the notifying party. Most parties, they use international sources where they can find some hazard information, and normally hazard information should be available through an assessment that was done in accordance with a globally harmonized system for classification and labeling, and this has then kind of a global, it's in a globally accepted scheme, which then can be used by anyone, and therefore there's no need for a notifying party to produce that data themselves, unless there's no data available. But an international source normally is sufficient to conclude, for us to conclude that that the criteria B1 and B2 are met. And then we consider, in addition, the exposure, and normally information on exposure is generated at national level, because if a country undertakes a risk assessment, then they certainly they look at the risk under their condition of use. So either be it the risk for operators or for workers under the conditions of use in the notifying party, or be it the risk for the environment, again under the environmental, ecological conditions in the notifying party. So exposure information is normally used by produced by notifying party, and details should be provided in the notification, and this information should then be reviewed by us. But the conclusion whether the information meets the criteria B1 and B2, this is really to be done on the basis of the information provided either in the notification or, and this is in many cases, the more important source, or in the available supporting documentation. And this is documentation provided by the notifying party to support their notification. So they do not provide all the details in the notification itself. And we, for example, from the European Union, when we submit a notification of final regulatory action, we give a very brief summary in the notification itself, but we provide, for example, the full risk assessment report in a separate document, and this is the so-called supporting documentation, where we as CRC members can find the necessary information in order to be able to conclude whether the criteria B1 and B2 are met. And going now into some scenarios that may come up. The next slide, please. So we have the first scenario, which we may be confronted with, and this is that there's no data in the notification nor in the supporting documentation, and there's no reference to a source of data. And in this case, it's impossible for us to conclude that the criteria are met simply because of the lack of information. So we would conclude the criteria are not met. And then continue with the second scenario, data are provided, but the source of the data is not referenced in the available documentation. And in such scenario, we would also normally conclude that the criteria are not met, since it's impossible for us to verify that the data have been generated according to scientific principles and procedures, and that the reviews have been performed and documented according to the generally recognized scientific principles and procedures. So again, due to the lack of information, it may not be possible to conclude that the criteria are met, and therefore the conclusion would be that the criteria are not met in such scenario. If we continue with the next slide, please. We have quite some heavy weather here in Brussels, so if there's some problems with the line, do not be surprised. Currently, it's heavy rainfall outside. So then we have the third scenario where data are not provided, but the information contains a reference to the source of the data that has been used in the risk evaluation. And this reference to the source then would allow us to verify the origin of the data, and then normally we are in a position to conclude that the criteria are met depending on where the data originate from. So if it's recognized sources, for example, risk evaluations undertaken under the Stockholm Convention or the Montreal Protocol, or other recognized sources, then this would allow us to conclude the criteria are met, because we can then assume that since it's reviewed data, that the data has been produced and reviewed in accordance with the recognized scientific methodology. And then we have the scenario number 4, where we have the full package of information. So we have the data, or some data that is contained either in the notification or the supporting documentation, and we have the source of the data, which is referenced. And here we can then check both the data and the source, and which would allow us to conclude that the criteria B1 and B2 are met, provided again that they are indeed produced and reviewed in accordance with scientifically recognized methods and principles. So we continue with the next slide, please. And again, a reminder, hazard and exposure should be considered in order to to establish whether the criteria B1 and B2 are met. And since this is sometimes a matter for discussion. So will we continue with the next slide, please? And now we look into criterion BIII, and this is to establish that the final regulatory action was based on the risk evaluation involving the prevailing conditions within the party taking the action. And this is sometimes quite challenging. It depends certainly on the information that is available to the CRC, but in the past we had many cases where it was quite difficult to dig out some details, some information from the information that has been submitted to the CRC in order to be able to take then a proper conclusion. And one particular point is here raised in the second, and we will come back to this in the second bullet, and we will come back to this later. And this refers to the use of data or information that originate from other parties, other countries, and that was used by the notifying party for their own assessment. And we already explained, or we already noted earlier, that hazard information is generally used from other sources, but sometimes also exposure information and exposure assessments can be used that originate from other countries. But in this case, a specific explanation has to be provided, and this is called bridging. Again, we will come back to this later in more detail, but I already wanted to mention it here at the beginning, since this may then come up in the following slides again. So the next slide, please. So what are now the examples of the scenarios that we may be confronted with when doing a review? So we have the risk evaluation undertaken by the notifying parties, taking into consideration the prevailing conditions in the party, and this links to exposure, to exposure of the environment or of humans, and we had cases, and this now cases that you also find in the notes in the handbook, where direct exposure of humans has been reported and was the basis for the final. So there's actual or measured exposure data that is either referenced or provided in the notification, where we can then see whether the criterion has been met. One example is the DNOC notification submitted by Peru. But we do not always get really data of direct exposure. In many cases today, and this is used by many countries, modeling is the tool that is used in order to do the risk assessment, and therefore a description is normally contained on how the modeling is done, and then we can conclude whether the criteria are met. And there are some cases referenced here, for example, methylparathione, a notification submitted by the European Union, where modeling was used in order to do the risk assessment. The next slide, please. In some cases, we are also having a mix of information that is composed of concrete data, but then in conjunction with some very specific socioeconomic considerations, and this then leads to a scenario where a certain exposure is expected or anticipated by the notifying party. This is sometimes a little bit difficult to figure out whether this approach has been used, but it depends on the information that is contained in the notification. And a recent case is a notification submitted by Brazil on metamidophos, where Brazil really reported non-authorized uses on certain crops that were a real problem for human health because those non-authorized uses resulted in residues on those crops that were above the legal maximum residue limits. So it was a real risk for the consumer. It was a very common use, so it was not a very special or use. It was a quite common use in Brazil. So each farmer, in a way, was of the view that this is really the pesticide that is used on that crop by everyone. So they were sometimes even not aware of the fact that they were using a non-authorized pesticide for that particular use. And they certainly were not aware of the fact that this type of use then resulted in the too high residues that represented a risk to the consumer. So the Brazilian authorities they concluded that there were two main issues. One was that the exposure of operators and workers was too high due to this use on the crops, and the second was then the too high risk for the consumers. And since the Brazilian authorities were aware of the fact that this was really a very common and broadly used way of using the chemical, then they took the regulatory action and banned the use of the chemical. So this is a mixture of really data plus the socioeconomic information that there was a particular use which was not also authorized on this particular crop that led then to the final regulatory action. The next slide, please. And in addition to human health, we also we get quite often information on exposure of the environment, and this can again be incidents involving direct exposure of wildlife or livestock, and again either we have really data measured exposure, like for example a case notified by the Netherlands, methyl bromide, where they had monitoring data and they observed a high toxicity to fish, and combining these two, they concluded the risk for the fish is too high, and therefore there was a ban on this pesticide. Or again, another case from Thailand and the sulfan, where they also did a comparison of the fish toxicity data and the effects on other non-toxic or non-target organisms, and they again concluded that due to the common use and the commonly applied dosage, the risk was too high, and therefore they took the final regulatory action. But again, here we can also have the expected or anticipated exposure, either through modeling that is quite often also used for the environmental risk assessment by many parties. And the next slide, please. And in the environment, or the environmental risk assessment, we can then have also a number of different scenarios where indirect exposure is the reason why a country concludes that a certain chemical should be banned because of too high risk. But when looking at this indirect exposure, we have to be really very careful, and we have to look into the details of the information that is made available through the notification, because the mere presence of a chemical in the environment in itself is normally not sufficient to conclude that a risk evaluation has been done taking into account the prevailing condition, because the presence of a chemical in the environment as such does not necessarily tell us whether this presence represents an unacceptable risk or not. So normally we would expect more information in order to be able to conclude that the criteria are met. Sometimes what can also be done by parties is that they take a regulatory action as a precautionary measure, like, for example, this case referenced here, MIREX by Canada, where they concluded, due to the intrinsic properties of the chemical and the risk of a potential exposure, they banned it as a precautionary measure. And sometimes we can also have indirect effects, like, for example, depletion of the ozone layer, and then which leads to an increased exposure to ultraviolet radiation, and this can then also be considered as a too high risk by a notifying party. The next slide, please. And we continue with criterion C, and criterion C is that the CRC is requested to consider whether the final regulatory action provides a sufficiently broad basis to merit listing. And again, we have a number of sub-criteria that help us to conclude. And the next slide, please. So the first two sub-criteria are whether the regulatory action would lead to a significant decrease in the quantity of the chemical used, or whether it would lead to a reduction of the risk. And this again, this is the sections that are contained in the notification, and the notifying party provides some information on those. But we also have some. We can also conclude on the basis of information that is not directly given by the notifying party. For example, if a chemical is banned, then we can expect that this would lead to a reduction of the use, and that it would also lead to a reduction of the risk. If it's a severe restriction, we cannot necessarily draw this conclusion. So we would need more information, and then we would then have to consider this on a case-by-case basis, really depending on the type of restriction and the question whether the restriction is in fact sufficient in order to be able to conclude that the criteria are met. Then we have the third criterion, and this is on the global relevance of the final regulatory action, so of the considerations that led to the final regulatory action. So the question is mainly whether it's a use which is really relevant under very specific circumstances that you would, for example, not find in any other country, or whether it's really a use and the related risks then to that use that you can find in a more or less similar way in other countries, and where you would then conclude that indeed the considerations that led to the final regulatory action are relevant at global level. So this again, it's information that we have to draw from the notification, and where we then are in a position to conclude whether the criterion is met or not. So, and here are some or two examples are given for human health. For example, normally it's a rather universal conclusion, because exposure of operators, exposure of farmers, this is something which is not limited to a specific geographical area. It's this is relevant for many countries, and for the environment, it can be that very specific conditions in a given country are the basis for the considerations, and that this would then limit it. But in most cases, this is not the case. So also the environmental considerations normally are of rather broad and international relevance, and allow then the conclusion that criterion C3 is met. The next slide, please. And then the next slide, please. It's on the question whether there's evidence of ongoing international trade, and there is in the preparation of each CRC, there is always an invitation of the Secretariat to send information on the international trade in the chemicals. So each party is invited to send information. Also, other stakeholders, for example, the CropLife, they normally also send information on this criterion, and then this allows us to conclude whether there is evidence of ongoing trade. But and this is explained in more details also in the working paper, that the absence of such information, since in many cases we do not have information on international trade, the absence does not necessarily then trigger the conclusion that the criterion is not met, and that then we would not be in a position to recommend that chemical for listing, because as we know, in many cases there is still a lot of trade ongoing, but we simply, as a CRC, we do not get the necessary information on such trade. The next slide, please. This is criterion D, and criterion D has been in the past quite often subject for intense discussions, but now we have quite robust guidance, and criterion D is on the intentional misuse. And it says that the CRC should take into account that intentional misuse is not in itself an adequate reason to list a chemical Annex 3. What does it mean? It means that if a country has taken final regulatory action in order to stop the intentional misuse of certain chemical, then we would then in fact not be able to conclude that intentional misuse was not the reason for this. This can be an issue, for example, if suicide, the use of a chemical for suicide is the reason for a ban, then we would not be in a position to conclude that intentional misuse was not the reason. So in this case, then in fact this would then not allow a recommendation for the listing if the only reason for regulatory action was intentional misuse. But again, please look at the available guidance where you can find more detailed information. The next slide, please. I see that the time is really running. So the next slide is now, and I already announced it earlier, it's on the bridging information, and the discussion on the bridging information, or whether bridging is done, is quite challenging during the CRC meetings, and sometimes quite interesting, because here we touch quite some fundamental issues. So what is bridging? Bridging is done when the notifying party has used the risk evaluation from another country or international body, not the boy, body, as the basis for its national decision. And this is in fact something that is normally encouraged by many because so many risk evaluations have already been done at global level, and there's no need for each country to repeat and repeat and repeat the work that has already been done. So in a way, this is encouraged, but in our context of the CRC, it can be a challenge. And therefore, there's this this detailed guidance now on how we should deal and how we could deal with a bridging. So again, the basic concept is a notifying party has used risk evaluation that has been done by another party as a basis for their national decision making. And when we are confronted with such case, then this is now the next slide, which gives again a little bit of background, where the conference of the parties, and this was based on the work done by the CRC, decided that the bridging information has to be provided if we concluded that final regulation, that the criteria B3 has been met, so that final regulatory action was done on the basis of risk evaluation under the prevailing conditions. And this is the key factor here, that some evidence has to be provided that the prevailing conditions in the notifying party have been the basis for the final regulatory action. So what is behind this quite difficult and complicated language? It is to check whether a party has used risk evaluation done by a different party and has simply copied the decision from that party. So by saying, well, this party does a very advanced and highly sophisticated risk assessment, so if they conclude that the risks are too high and that they ban the chemical, then we do the same. So if this is done, which is certainly perfectly possible for each party, but if this is the way the decision has been taken, then in fact there would be no evidence and there would be no prevailing conditions that have been considered by the notifying party. But on the other hand, if a party says, well, this country did a very good risk assessment, and we take this risk assessment, we draw our conclusions from the risk assessment, and we apply the results to the conditions that are prevailing in our country, and then we take a decision, a national decision. This is in fact what is the bridging about, and we as a CRC, we are requested to check whether we find any evidence in the documentation that this kind of approach has been used by the notifying party. The next slide, please. And now, based on the information that is presented to us, we would then conclude either that the criteria BIII is not met if we do not have any information on how the prevailing conditions of the party has been taken into account. The way how this evidence is presented can be very different, and this is also sometimes a challenge. And here we have one example for the Montreal Protocol, where the bridging is done by a simple explanation that the depletion of the ozone layer has an adverse effect on human health and the environment, and it's known that certain chemicals have this effect, and if applied to the conditions in the notifying party, then this would be sufficient to demonstrate the bridging. So some kind of explanation or statement, so that demonstrate how the information originating from a different source has been used and applied by the notifying party to their national circumstances is important in order for us to conclude on whether the bridging has been done correctly or not. The next slide, please. Again, when doing this assessment, then we analyze the information that has been made available to us. We check whether it's in fact information mainly originating from an international source, so a conclusion or under the Montreal Protocol or the Stockholm Convention, or whether it's really done on the basis of a national risk evaluation. And then we check what is the explanation, what is the evidence provided by the notifying party on the application of this knowledge to their national circumstances in order to conclude on this criterion. And next slide, please. When doing this, it's clear, and you already, when listening to this quite extensive explanations, you can already conclude yourself that this can only be done on the case-by-case basis, because we are confronted with so many different scenarios and so many different types of information that we receive from the notifying parties, that this is indeed a case-by-case review. In some cases, it's even necessary to go back to the notifying party and to request some further explanations or details, because the documentation is not always clear, in order for us to really to take a robust conclusion on whether the criteria are met or not. Next slide, please. And for the bridging information, where we normally look at in the notification and the background documentation, is the form of the use. So what is the use in the country that did the risk assessment, and what is the use in the country that provided the notification? Then how was it used, and also what are the risk mitigation measures? And this allows then also gives some background information and allows or helps us to conclude whether the criteria are met. And the same is then for the industrial chemicals, where we also look at the different types of information that is available in order then also to see whether this bridging is indeed acceptable and has been demonstrated in an appropriate way or not. And this brings us to the end of this presentation. Sorry, it took quite some time, but I hope it helps you to better understand how the criteria under Annex 3 are applied. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jürgen, for the presentation. The presentation is very rich in content, and thank you very much. This is really a very core, essential presentation for the work of the CRC. And in a real face-to-face orientation workshop, we would have also a case study following to these presentations. And I see that we are running over the time, and I hope, I don't know whether participants would mind if we go beyond a bit, because we have a second presentation which is shorter, so which is about the process of the intersessional work. Having said that, anybody has any questions to Jürgen's presentation? Okay, if there's no question immediately, you can always contact Jürgen or us, the Secretariat, by email. We will be happy to discuss with you further. And as Jürgen also indicated, there are various sections of the handbook. There is one dedicated section on application of criteria B, another one application of criteria D. So there are many information in the handbook that's for further reading. And if there's no question immediately, then I would suggest that we continue with the next presentation by Ms. Surish Amishant. Ms. Surish is a CRC member from Guyana. He has experience in leading intersessional work. So, Surish, please, over to you.
So thank you, Jan. And I will start by saying greetings to everyone, because I know we are from different parts of the world, so our time zones are different. I'm also cognizant of the fact that we, are you hearing me?
Yes.
Oh, great, thanks. Yeah, I'm also cognizant of the fact that we are a bit back on time, so I'll try my best to put it as clear as possible and at the same time try to make some time so that we can get this presentation over with. Jan, can you put it up on slide for me, please, the presentation? I also know that in this type of communication, we tend to probably have to keep our heads on to be focused most of the time. So maybe we can do like my friend, that is my Canadian counterpart, Martin, is doing and having some coffee in the meantime. So I'm waiting on the presentation. I'm not seeing it on the slide.
Yeah. Emily, could you please post the next presentation?
So it is actually already displayed on the screen. Can you see?
No, I'm only seeing the last slide of the first
Okay,
presentation.
so let me check.
So we will also send you the presentations, both presentations after the webinar. Okay, probably just a few words regarding orientation workshop and the orientation webinar session for those members who joined the committee just recently. So in the past, we organized several times orientation. So now I see the presentations uploaded, so I will not steal your time. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Jan. Okay, my task this morning is basically to have a little go through on the operation of the intersessional task group, of which we all know we are all members of that group. So I'll probably move myself right. So what's the role and mandate of the intersessional task group? As we know, it's not feasible for the CRC at the meeting to initiate a detailed review of the notifications or proposals and all the supporting documents in the time that is available for these meetings. We know from experience the amount of submissions that do come in, and obviously time is a factor there. So that gives rise to what we call or say are the intersessional task groups. And the task really is to undertake a preliminary review of notifications before the CRC meets. And the mandate of the task group is to it finishes before the start of the CRC meeting. So it basically works pre the CRC meetings. And at the commencement of the CRC meeting, that task or that mandate ceases there. The work of the task group does not replace, and I emphasize this because it's clear for us to understand, it does not replace the requirement for each of the candidate chemical or severely hazardous pesticide formulation to be considered by the full committee. In other words, the final decision is taken by the full committee and not by the intersessional task group. Pre-structured information in task group report facilitate the preparation of rationales at CRC. So in other words, if we format on already existing information that are coming in from various sources and put it in a detailed form and a simple form, then it's easier for us to have a rationale whenever required for the CRC. A little bit on the introduction. As some of us may be aware, and for the new members, I apologize. Welcome. I know I have my counterpart from the Caribbean, Jonah. Welcome to you. Yeah, for an introduction, COP2 adopted a process for the preparation of the decision guidance documents, or what is termed the flow chart. And this information can be sourced from where that link is, and also in page 4 to 5 of the CRC handbook. This gives rise to the intersessional task group as part of that chart, and that was where it is established. So the task group preliminary reviews that they undertake the preliminary review of the notification and supporting documentation, I mentioned this, for chemicals scheduled for the CRC. So that's basically what the whole purpose is for the intersessional task group. CRC adopted the guidance document, the guidance of the intersessional task group in CRC handbook. You get that information from page 37. So I also want to, before I proceed, I also want to go, because of the nature of time and how this presentation is being done, I would advise the new participant to spend some time on the CRC handbook and the bucket guide. And as time progresses, you will see that you will fit into these terms and what is required very simply. Membership and composition of the task groups. Task group consists of one or two coordinators and a representative group of members of the CRC. One of the coordinator, not from the notifying party, and you would have understood the notifying party, who is the notifying party from the previous presentation, serve as the chair. So if a notifying party is sending in a notification, then that person from that part of the notification party or region will not be the chair. While another could be from the notifying party and act as the drafter. So the notifying party can have the drafter, and then the chair can come from another big region. Task group is established by the Secretariat in consultation with the Bureau, but members are free to join any additional task group. So it's allocated, members are allocated to various task groups responsible for various chemicals or the severely hazardous pesticide formulation, but members still have the opportunity, if they want to join any other groups that have any other chemicals that their name are not on. All members of the CRC are expected to participate in the work of at least one task group. That's clear. I don't have to belabor that. So what does task group do? They review notification and supporting documentations for each chemical or severely hazardous pesticide formulations, in keeping with criteria in Annex 2 for a chemical or Annex 4 for the SHPF, and that they are met. So they review and make sure that those criteria for the Annex 2 and the Annex 4 are met. Structure the information in an Excel table for ease of reference. So there's an Excel spreadsheet, and as new members get more familiar with it, they will see that is where the basis of the information is tabulated and then move towards the report. The group will then prepare a draft task group report, which will then be posted on the web. The finalized task group report will be done the day before the CRC meeting, and this will be done by members and observers. So observers will have a chance now to have their points taken. The task group coordinator, which will be the chair and the drafter, present a summary of the task group findings at the CRC meeting. So after that first day where the finalized draft will be completed, then the coordinators of that chemical that we're discussing will present that report at the CRC meeting. The task group report may highlight particular issues for attention of the committee, and that may be, for an example, where the different members have different groups, different views with respect to the candidate chemical that we're speaking about. The procedure for the intersessional task group, it's not that difficult, so it's clear for us to understand. Notification for chemical, and you would have heard it from the first presentation, a bit of it. Notification from the first for chemicals are submitted to the Secretariat, that is stage one. The Secretariat determines whether these notifications include information required by Annex 1 of the Convention. If this is the case, if those information meets the Annex 1, for at least two notifications from two PIC regions, the chemical will be considered for CRC. So it's basically two notifications coming from two PIC regions. So not two notifications coming from the same PIC region, and that's for a chemical. For the severely hazardous pesticide formulations, a proposal from one party is sufficient. And this is one is keeping with this information requirement in Annex 4, Part 1 of the Convention. Additional information is also collected from parties by the Secretariat, and then that is also forwarded once it's satisfied to the CRC. Prior to the CRC meeting, the Secretariat forwards the notification, proposals, and additional information to the task group to carry out the preliminary review. So basically, notifications or the proposal goes to the Secretariat initially. The Secretariat vets that, makes sure that it reaches the requirement of that part there, and then once it reaches requirement, it's then forwarded to the task group for the review, to carry out the preliminary review, of which at the end of that preliminary review, it goes to the CRC meeting, if I'm to just precise it. The task group coordinators are tasked to prepare the first draft of the report of the preliminary review of a chemical or the severely hazardous pesticide formulation, and take the lead in initiating and mediating discussion among the task group members. The draft report is circulated to all task group members to commence. All task group members shall review the notification, the supporting documentation, and the draft task report. So that's basically the task or the mandate of the individual members of the group. Communication among task group members during the intertestamental period is very important. It usually takes place by email, but teleconference can be arranged. I know in addition to that, we have had over the past year, CRC 14, CRC 15, where we would have also have other means of communication, WhatsApp, dealing with the same information passing. Task group reports should provide sufficient detail for the committee to understand the reasoning behind the conclusion of the task group with respect to the individual requirements. So it's a requirement that is listed under the conventions that has to be satisfied. The report should reflect clearly that it reaches those requirements so that we can able to have a finalized and definitive conclusion. In undertaking the preliminary review, the task group should consider the policy guidance and working procedure developed by the guide to work with the CRC. As I mentioned earlier, this is why the CRC handbook is so important. From my own experience for the new members, I can tell you that even after our force orientation, we were still like somewhere in the ocean, but you were seeing the island. So you're not like in the middle of the ocean. But after we came home and had a look at the handbook and went through it, that's when all started to come together and it becomes a little easier for us. Task group coordinators should be prepared to lead the discussion on their task group chemical at the CRC meeting. So that is where once the report is done and submitted to the meeting, the task group coordinators, the draft, and the chair would normally give a little briefing as to the results of that and the conclusion of that report. It is adamant that all CRC members should participate actively in all the discussions that we have had, not specifically and only to the chemicals that you fall as a member under, but to all the chemicals. So that is why it's important that we have these discussions to have concrete decisions coming out of CRC. In terms of the timeline, the step-by-step process, as you were aware, these institutional work is being done prior to the meeting, so most obviously it's being done online and communication from various parts of the world. So a schedule is set, and for this CRC 16, by June 19th is when we will start the task group work, create it obviously and start the work. The notification and supporting documentation for the chemical schedule for CRC are posted on the convention website. So it's advisable that we visit the convention website as soon as by the 19th. Apart from notification also will be coming to the Secretariat to individual members. By July the 10th, so let's say what, a little over 3 weeks, task group coordinators circulate the initial draft task group report to the members. This is where the drafter and the chair will normally come up with a draft, a very, let's say, rough draft of the initial report, and then send it out to members. By the 24th, which is 2 weeks after, of July, task group members will send back their comments to the coordinators. And by the 3rd of August, the coordinators revise the report and sends to the Secretariat. So this clear schedule. So I want our members to understand that these timelines, though they might be flexible from time to time, this year I know we are a little tasked for time because of the situations that we are in with the COVID pandemic. But I would advise that we try to, as far as possible, put some time out during these scheduled dates so that we can be able to have our input in these review of whichever chemicals are to be discussed. By the 13th of August, Secretariat posts the draft report on the convention website for members and observers to comment. Good, so that's where it's on the website now. But remember, our meeting starts in September on the 7th to 11th, if I recall the schedule. So on the 7th of September, the task group pre-meeting online to finalize the report. And this has to take into account comments from the CRC members and observers. So once that, on the 13th, remember the Secretariat would have posted it online. And that's when the observers and members will have any other comments. And then on the day before the meeting, that's when we will have the finalized draft report there. The task group meeting is open to all CRC members and observers. So that this is at the meeting, open to all CRC members and observers. At the CRC 16 meeting, this is the day when we will commence the meeting now in September, task group coordinators present the results of the review and the task group report. So as I mentioned it earlier, there will normally be a results review, basically a conclusion, and the task group report to the CRC. All CRC members discuss this report and decide on whether or not the notification meets the criteria of Annex 2 to the convention. So that's the final analysis and gist of actually reviewing all the work that would have been done during the pre-meeting, or what we will call the intersessional meeting. Notification to be considered at CRC 16. So this is basically what work we will be doing at the meeting. CRC 16 is to consider a new notification of final regulatory action for fluorooctanoic acid, PFOA, its salts, and PFOA-related compounds submitted by Norway. The new notification, take note here, the new notification replaces the one that Norway already submitted and was reviewed and concluded by CRC 14. So at CRC 14, Norway would have already made a submission, and it was reviewed and concluded that all criteria of Annex 2 of the convention have been met in decision CRC 14/5. So after we would have reviewed this new submission here at CRC 16 in September, if it concludes that the new notification meets this criteria of Annex 2 to the convention again, then we'll have to consider amending recommendations adopted in the decision at CRC 14/15. So whatever, if this one reached the criteria now, then we will consider what the CRC 14 decision was taken so that it can be amended to take this one into consideration. The intersessional task group for the CRC 16 is to undertake preliminary review of the new notification of, oh boy, I'm using back the same slide? No, right. Is to undertake preliminary review of the new notification of PFOA, salts, and PFOA, to focus on those sections of the notification that are different from the previous notification from Norway. So this is actually channeling us exactly where we should be moving towards discussing at the CRC 16. What are the new information that was submitted in addition to what the initial submission was made in CRC 14 review? And to prepare a task group report based on rationale adopted in CRC 14/15. So once we would have accepted that, then a rationale will be prepared based on the CRC 14/15. So the group, the task group, is basically for the PFOA and its related compounds. The chair is Miss, please excuse me if my pronunciation is not too good here, Miss Aniszka Janoskov from Poland, and my friend Mr. Timo Sepala from Finland. And obviously, all the CRC members have to be part of that task group. The Secretariat, I know, will allocate accordingly. Well, in this case, is one PFOA at this point in time. I think that brings me up. So what lessons have we learned? As I mentioned, we are back in time, so and we want to complete at least some of the work. I know next year will be a big hard year in terms of the amount of chemicals that we will have to discuss. So I encourage us all to start early in our review, in our assessment. We know the schedule is tight. If in doubt, especially for our new members, please consult the convention text, the CRC handbooks, our coordinators around, the secretariat, or even persons who were here before, not necessarily coordinators, members who are here from probably 2 or 4 years back. And for this, I want to urge our members for this process to be successful, as it has been in all the CRC that we would have known and I would have attended. Communication and collaboration is very important, and contribution from all members is very, very essential for us to have a successful and effective conclusion of any chemicals that we have to review on. I thank you. I think that brings me to the end of this presentation. Thank you.
Any questions? I don't see any hand raising, but from the chat, I see that Suki asked for floor after the first presentation. Do you still want to have the floor?
Thanks, Yun. Thanks, Suresh, and thanks, Eugen. First, I'd like to indicate that, and good afternoon, all colleagues, that Daniel from Tanzania is not well. He's in hospital. That's why he couldn't join today's session. Having said that, mine is I wanted to encourage us all, particularly the new members. It is okay to ask a question. And it is, there's no question that is not a good question. There's no question that is small or too much, because it's only when you ask questions that you get to understand. It is like Suresh just indicated now, our participation individually and collectively, it's very important. For example, when we are asking, when we are not certain of something, when you ask when we are still together alone, it's better, you'll get a better understanding, and also you'll help another one of us who might be having some uncertainties in terms of understanding fully, and by asking a question, you may be helping somebody else. It is better that we understand as a team before we bring on board observers, for example, so that all of us are working together and moving together as a team, not leaving some behind. Of course, we'll move at different paces. There are those that are advanced and experienced, but we are here collectively as the old members to work and to enable each and every one of us to understand. And the presenters are experienced in this, and so I'm encouraging everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Tuki, for encouraging the words. Again, I would like to offer all participants for questions. We take any question you may have. I see no hand raising. Thank you very much for staying on with us over the time. And just a few words about the orientation session and orientation workshop. So initially we plan to have an orientation workshop, which we have successfully conducted several times in the past. In the orientation workshop, we would have also case study after each of these two presentations, so have some practical exercises, which is of course more efficient if we could have. And also the orientation workshop, again, we organized it because members asked for it. So we also, in the future, it again is based on request. If members feel that they have continuously interested in having orientation workshop, then they can make a request to the secretariat, and then we can look for additional funds to support such workshops in the future. Because the orientation workshop is not like the actual CRC meeting, which is a must. It's in the core budget. The workshop is really supported by extra budget, and in the past we were lucky enough to have the support from the EU and also from the FAO to conduct several times the orientation workshop. At the moment, as you all know, we are not able to conduct any physical meetings, so we try to use the webinar to at least provide some information on the work of the CRC as we do today. So again, we will be happy to hear feedback from you. I see that in the chat you have some positive feedback to the presentations, but I don't see any questions. And let me check whether anybody raised their hand. No. Okay. Since we are already over the time, I would just thank you again for joining and for bearing with us over the time, and thank you to everyone, in particular to Peter Dawson, who is also with us, and he is from New Zealand. So for him, it's I think it's 3 or 2 o'clock in the night. So thank you for your commitment, and thank you, Zurich and Jürgen, for your presentation. If there's no request for floor, then I would like to say goodbye to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.